Okay. Well, we'll go ahead.
My favorite video.
We'll go ahead and get started anyway. We're in part 4 of the 3 of a Kind series. Like I said earlier, it'll be found in the Gospel of Matthew, the 26th chapter. I want to dive right in to that text. I just want to say that as you're looking at it, you might be a little bit surprised that we'll be preaching from this text, especially we're going to be looking at verse 36, because it's not a text that is normally preached from. Not that there's anything wrong with it. It's just the fact that it works better in a context, especially as we approach Easter, to read it. So usually during Holy Week, you'll hear this text read, and usually there's not much commentary that's added to it, because there are 3 prayers that Jesus prayed, and in those prayers, they're not very complex prayers on the surface, and so oftentimes there's not much commentary that's added to it. But actually, as I was studying this deeper, I found that there's actually a lot going on beneath the surface, and I'm excited to share that because it's just amazing when you realize what Jesus is actually praying for in this moment. So in verse 36 of chapter 26, it says that Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And as they get to this place, Jesus immediately will give some instructions to his disciples. He says, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." That would have been a welcome relief to hear. Because when you look to the context of what Jesus is saying, what comes before this, there is some things that are happening that are going to make the disciples very happy to hear the words, "Sit down for a moment. Take a moment and sit here." If you look at verse 2 of the same chapter, it says, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man, Jesus, will be handed over to be crucified." This is the news that just broke to the disciples. It's not that this is the first time that this has been on the radar, but it is very clear. It's now. The time is now. It's 2 days away, and I'm going to be crucified. Now look at verse 21. "One of you that are here, as they have the Last Supper together, one of you will betray me." So the news that's hit is I'm going to be crucified. Passover's 2 days away, and one of you who's sitting at this table with us right now is going to betray me. Judas, who was identified as the betrayer, is not even with them in the garden anymore. He has left. And so there is a lot going on, but it's not just that. There's even more news. Verse 31. "All fall away on account of me." All of you. And then verse 34, "Truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. He's talking to Peter. Peter's like, "Jesus, I'm going to be there with you through it all. It doesn't matter." He says, "No, Peter, even you, before the rooster crows 3 times, you will deny me, disown me." And so, Marty McFly, whoa, this is heavy. I mean, there's a moment in that movie where he's just overwhelmed by what he has seen and what he has experienced. And that is exactly how the disciples must have felt in that moment. And so Jesus says, "I want you all, the 11 that are here, to take a moment and sit right here, because I'm going over there and I'm going to pray." And really, Jesus is modeling what the disciples should have been doing in that moment. I mean, things are heavy. This is troubling times. This is troubling news. But they don't take it to the next level. They don't stop and sit there and pray. Instead, they sit there and they just are almost overwhelmed by the moment. And as it all unfolds, they'll all scatter. And they'll flee in fear. And that's because they didn't communicate with God the Father. They didn't receive what they needed in that moment. There's a lot to learn in verse 36. First of all, unless you've done a geographical study of Gethsemane or taken a Holy Land tour and actually had your feet touch the ground and seen what's around you, when you hear the place Gethsemane, it doesn't trigger anything in our minds as far as a reference point because we've never been there. We've heard the story in the garden, but we've never experienced it firsthand. And so we've never had a Thursday morning jog through the garden. Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Sheboygan. How many people have ever been to Sheboygan before? Now, if you've ever experienced it before, if you're not from Michigan, you're like, what is he talking about? What's it like? What is Sheboygan like? Well, if you're not from here, you wouldn't know that this time of year, it's a great place to go skiing. If you like to ski, you can ski in Sheboygan. Maybe you like fishing, or hiking, or kayaking, or hunting. Great place to visit. In fact, it's only a 20-minute drive straight up 23 to Mackinac City from Sheboygan. Wonderful. But we all know this. We have a reference point of Sheboygan. By the way, this message is sponsored by Pure Michigan. If you've never been to Sheboygan, your reaction to someone who has not been there before is probably like, you gotta go, you gotta check it out. It's a cool place. It's beautiful. Gethsemane is a beautiful place. But especially if you love the outdoors, just like Sheboygan, if you love the outdoors, you got to check it out. It's at the foot of the Mount of Olives. But don't take my word for it because I've never been there. So I'm just letting you know what I've studied and what I've come across. If you've never been there, today it's kind of neat because you can just go to TripAdvisor. What is people saying about it today? In fact, it's got a 5-star rating, over 2,000 reviews. It's the 12th ranked place to visit out of 313 in the Holy Land. So you're probably going to want to put it on your itinerary if you ever go to Israel. Check out this place. And so here's some pictures. I just want to put it up there because I'm a visual guy. This is it today. This is the garden where Jesus is praying at the foot of the Mount of Olives with the 11. It's so beautiful. There's another angle, not as good. But there's just beautiful trees. It's just gorgeous there. And I wanted to put those up there for you to kind of take it in and know that this is the spot that Jesus tells the 11. I want you to sit down, sit here while I go over there. I'm gonna spend some time in prayer. Now the word Gethsemane is actually in the Hebrew comes from 2 words. You've got your sermon notes, you can follow along here. It comes from this word, I'm going to butcher it real bad because my Hebrew is even worse than my Greek. So that'll just give you an idea. Gat is the first word, and it's this Hebrew word from Gemal and Tav, and it means a wine press. And then the second word, I have no idea, Shemonim or something like that, is oils. And so when you put Gat and Shemonim or whatever it is, it forms this new word, Gethsemane, and it would mean in the Hebrew, wine press of oils. Wine press of oils. That's the place that they're at. Of course, it makes sense because if you're there, if your feet are on the ground and you're looking around and you leave the garden and you start to go up the mountain, what they would do is they would go up to the mountain and they would gather all of these olives and they'd bring them back down the mountain and then they would press them there in the garden. That was the spot. And so it got this name, Gethsemane, the place where the olives are pressed. And so, looking at this from what Jesus is about to go through, Jesus in this moment is being pressed. It's like the olives were pressed there. But he was able, in the immense pressure that he faced, to press on. First, because he knows through prayer that this is the will of God our Father. And second, because by faith, Jesus knows that this is going to be temporary. And then on the other side of this, when I get through this, when I go to the cross and I rise from the dead on the 3rd day, there is great joy. on the other side of my suffering. Jesus pressed on in the Garden of Gethsemane as he prayed. And now it is beautiful. It's a beautiful illustration to see the flip side of that. In that pressed moment, that intense moment, the 11, they take a different course. And you can see that it caused fear and it caused scattering. Because even though they were told it's God's will, they weren't receiving from God in the moment what they needed to press on. In fact, Jesus would come back and keep finding them asleep. And couldn't you stay awake just this little bit of time with me and pray? They were exhausted. They were being pressed on as well, but they weren't able to press on. Jesus was, as a result of him praying. Now, what you might not know about Gethsemane and what this is a picture, a symbolic picture of what is happening in the spiritual, is that in the Bible, wine and oil are a symbol of the favor of God. There's many texts about that. Psalm 104, Hosea 2, Joel 2. And olive oil is only produced, you can only produce it under great pressure. And olive oil is a sign of joy. It's joy for those who produce it. It's valuable. And it was life because it was what they would use for cooking and making things. And so it symbolizes what Jesus' death and eventual resurrection would produce. It would produce great joy. The suffering and the sacrifice of Jesus allowed the Holy Spirit to be poured out on those who would believe in him. And there is great joy in our salvation. Joy in the promise of what is to come for all eternity. But Jesus first had to go on to the press where he prayed. So look at verse 36. It says, Jesus tells his disciples, I want to keep this very clear in our minds. Sit here while I go over there and pray. And then Jesus picks out 3 of the 11. Any guesses who the 3 might be? And this ties in really good to last week's message. Which 3 are going? Who are going to be picked out from Jesus?
Peter, James, and John.
Yes, it always is that order. Peter, James, and John. Yes. He picks out the same 3 that go up to the Mount of Transfiguration who are going to see the very glory of God. And of course, this is another message of what's happening. The stone, the law, this stone is Peter. The supplanter, James. And God is a gracious giver. God's grace, John, are the 3 that are chosen. It's a message of what is happening here. That the old covenant, the law, is being fulfilled in their midst. And in the new covenant, which has been prophesied in Jeremiah 31, is about to spring forth. He took 3 and he left 8. And the 3 he took, like I mentioned earlier, they all saw his glory on the mountain. And now they are all going to witness his suffering. His glory and his suffering, and they've seen it all. Because by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, everything is established. And so they are there in that moment to see exactly what it is that is taking place through these 3 prayers that he is going to pray. It says in verse 37, he took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with them. That would be James and John. He began to be sorrowful and got an ESPN message about Michigan. That's great timing. I got to set those off. That's funny. I don't really want to go to that. But there we have Peter, James, and John. I don't need my phone at all. That's a distraction. And he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Now this is important for us to see, to be sorrowful and troubled. I wish that I could enlighten you and enlighten myself more in the Greek of what this means. I wish there was more depth because there's a lot happening. What does that mean to be sorrowful and troubled? What level is this at? But in verse 37, when you go to the Greek, what it means in the Greek is he was sorrowful and troubled. So What it says is what it means, exactly. There is no wiggle room for extra definitions or a different angle to look at this. Jesus in verse 37, he takes the three, and at this point he is sorrowful and troubled. But there is a big difference between verse 37 and verse 38, because a different word is going to be introduced. And it takes it to a whole nother level, because, all of us, the human experience is that we all face times where we are sorrowful and troubled. And there's a wide variety of levels of sorrow and trouble that we do find. But in verse 38, it actually brings it to the exact degree of how sorrowful and how troubled Jesus is. It says, my soul, then he said to them, Jesus speaks, and in his words, he reveals the very state of his heart. And I think it's very unique that Pastor Steve, who had no idea I was going to be preaching in Matthew 26, would talk about the heart during our time and our devotion. And so he's going to reveal the state of his soul and the state of his heart. He says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. That's a perfect translation from Greek to English. Paralipos. It means overcome with sorrow to the point of death. That's what it means in the Greek. It isn't just that I'm sad. It isn't that I'm just troubled a little bit. In verse 38, it takes it to the degree I'm about to die from this. That is how intense this suffering and this agony is. Maybe you've wondered about this before. Is it really possible to die from what is known as a broken heart syndrome? You ever maybe thought about that? Well, if you have Netflix and you've ever watched The Notebook, you already know the answer to that. Spoiler alert. It is possible to die from a broken heart. If it's on that movie, it must be true. What Jesus is experiencing... I can't believe I used a notebook. Not in Pastor Matt's wheelhouse. What Jesus is experiencing and his concern about how bad it really is recently, it's amazing because this happened a little over 2,000 years ago, scientifically has been proven just recently to be true. There is an exact science to this. They did a study in Denmark that revealed that individuals whose cohabitating partner or spouse who had died, they had an increased risk of getting AF, which has to do with your heart. That's abbreviation. Atrial fibrillation. Whatever. I'm not a doctor. I'm a ministry doctor, not a medical doctor. But within 30 days of bereavement, the risk estimated to be 41% higher than average. The risk was highest 8 to 14 days after the loss. Not right away, because if you've lost someone close to you, you know that those first few days you're almost in a fog. You're just like, and it happens in different stages in different ways. But the first few days, it's just kind of, you're just reeling. But from day 8 to day 14, they say it's 90% higher than average that you would have this happen to you. And they said it gradually declined to a level close to that of non-bereaved population after 1 year. So there is some good news there, that after a year of grieving the loss of a loved one, it's not that it goes away, but the fact that it gets to a place where your levels start to get to that point of someone who is non-bereaved. And they said, interestingly enough, where deaths were likely due to ill health, meaning you knew it was coming, you have this long, prolonged chance to say goodbye and to be with that person. They said there's no increased risk of AF in the partners after loss by those who were expecting it. So why would Jesus be troubled to the point of death? Matthew 26:38. There's a clue here. I never saw this before, and I'm excited to share it with you. You know, being troubled in his soul, in Jesus' soul, was nothing new. In fact, Jesus' soul was troubled on the same account 6 days before that in John 12:27. But now, he was beyond that. He was so sorrowful, it was to the point of death. We know that Jesus was described as a man of sorrows all his days, acquainted with griefs, being reproached and persecuted by men. But now a new scene of sorrows unfolds. And the reason for it, before he was afflicted by men. But at this point, at this moment in Jesus' life, he's now going to be bruised and put to grief by his Father as prophesied in Isaiah 53:10. Before it was mankind, and Jesus could deal with that. But now in this moment, his Father in heaven is about to put him to grief. Isaiah 53:10 and 11 says, "It was the Lord's good plan to crush him and cause him grief. Yet when his life is made as an offering for sin, he will have many descendants. He will enjoy a long life, and the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands. When he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied. And because of his experience, my righteous servant will make it possible for many to be counted righteous, for he will bear all their sins." And so, what to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. This is another verse in Isaiah 1:11. "I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight, I do not have pleasure in the blood of bulls or the lambs or the he-goats." Now the word for delighting, and the reason I brought Isaiah 1 into it, to look at Isaiah 53, is because the pleasure that he takes, or the delight in, is the same Hebrew word used in Isaiah 53:10. The Lord was pleased to bruise him. Now, when we read that, you might be really confused. Why would God our Father be pleased to crucify his Son? I mean, especially what we know about God. God is love. And of course, God loves his Son so much. Why would it please him to crucify his Son? Now, the prophecy is a picture of Jesus being crucified. That is the bruising portion. And making himself an offering for our sin. The prolonging of his days that Isaiah talks about is the fact of his resurrection to eternal life after death. And when it says he will see his offspring, it means the fruit of his suffering is that many will be saved from sin and death. God's pleasure is not in crucifying Jesus. God's pleasure is in what the Son's death has accomplished. It says at the end of verse 10, "The pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand." I take that to mean that he is not pleased in the suffering of his Son, but he is pleased in what the suffering of his Son will lead to. In that very moment when the Son was taking upon himself everything that God hates in us, and God was forsaking him to death, even then the Father knew that the measure of his Son's suffering was the depth of his Son's love for his Father's glory. And that in that love, our Father could take the greatest pleasure in it. And so, Jesus was troubled to the point of death, because this is what God the Father must do. Look at verse 39 of Matthew 26. It says, going a little farther, Luke knows this garden really well. He gives us a measurement of how much a little farther is. A little farther could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. On vacation, my kids ask, "Are we there yet?" No, we're not there yet. If we were there yet, we'd be stopped and we'd be getting out of the car. Are we there yet? Well, how much farther is it? It's a little farther. And then maybe you can sprinkle in a rest stop and a McDonald's run and something else, and then a little farther we finally get there. But a little farther can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. A little farther might be a few feet, it could be a few miles. How much is a little farther? Luke lets us know. He says in Luke's Gospel 22:41, about a stone's cast. How many of you had a remodeling project on your house and they asked, well, what are the dimensions of the room that you would like to have built? I'd like it to be about a stone's cast. Anyone ever use that as a form of measurement? Modern measurement? I think our swimming pool should be about a stone's cast in length. Width, maybe about half of a stone's cast. I don't know. I guess it's interesting because everyone can throw a stone a little bit further from other people. But a stone's cast in Bible times, in the days of antiquity, would have been about 50 or 60 feet. So if you lay down 5 or 6 basketball hoops, that is 50 to 60 feet. So we know that Jesus is not that far away when he leaves them. A little farther is actually just a little farther. In fact, if they weren't asleep, they might actually be able to hear the prayers that are taking place. But Jesus wants to make sure, so he takes the 3 with them, Peter, James, and John. In fact, it's just to make sure that they get every word of what he's about to say. He fell with his face to the ground and prayed. I've heard that story, that account, many times. And I've never stopped at this moment because we've been told that Jesus is at the point of death with his sorrow, and so he falls to the ground and he prays. And so we would think that that's a natural reaction to take. We're sorrowful. And so we go to the ground in prayer. We almost just can't even pick ourselves up because we just have such heaviness of heart. But that's not what this means. When Jesus fell to the ground and prayed to God the Father, something bigger is being done in this moment. Jesus is making a proclamation because what he is doing is against the law. The Old Testament law, well, there's another bonus point. Jesus prays, let me get this one in there, and then we'll talk about this one. Jesus prays the greatest prayer in the world. What hung in the balance of his prayer, and that's what we're going to see in a moment, and we see in this moment he's fallen to the ground, and he's praying, which is against the law. What hung in the balance was the glory of God's grace and the salvation of the entire world. But I want to get back to that point. Oh, it's not in here. Okay, here's a bonus point. Jesus fell with his face to the ground and he prayed. And the Jewish law said unless one knows in himself that he is as righteous as Joshua, you are not allowed to fall to the ground and pray to God. And so what Jesus is doing in this moment as he does this, as it might have even been a little bit surprising, even though his disciples know who he is and what he's called to do, but they're just kind of reeling. He is making the declaration that he is the only one who is worthy to be sacrificed for the sins of the world. I am righteous. Righteous enough to go to the cross for all of you. In fact, he's more righteous than Joshua, but Joshua was the standard at that point for the Israelites. So the first prayer, are we all ready for this? I'm going to move through these quickly. These are very short prayers, and they all point us to something powerful. He says in prayer 1, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus is pleading with God, if it's possible to save men and carry out the divine work of redeeming them, let me know what it is. I know the plan to this point, but is there another way to pull this off, to do this? Oh, here's the point in my notes. Jesus prays the greatest prayer, and when he prayed that first prayer, what hung in the balance is the glory of God and the salvation of the world. Not that everyone in the world is saved, but the opportunity for all who believe to be saved. The success of Jesus' mission on earth depended on Jesus' prayer and the answer that would be given. He prayed with reverence before God, and his request was given. God immediately answers Jesus' prayer. But we wouldn't know this. We wouldn't know that Jesus had his prayer answered unless we read Luke's account and unless we go to Hebrews to hear that God answered Jesus' prayer right there in that moment. In Hebrews 5:7, it says, in the days of his flesh, talking about when Jesus walked the earth, Jesus offered up prayers, Hebrews 5:7, and supplications with loud cries and tears. He's talking about in the garden. Jesus cried out to God, and he had tears. Blood actually flowed from his eyes. He cried to God, to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard. It says, Hebrews 5:7, Jesus was heard because of his reverence. He was heard. Heard means that Jesus' prayer was answered. That first prayer he prayed was answered. But wait, the cup was not removed. Precisely. We know Jesus suffered the fullness of physical pain and divine wrath. So in what sense was Jesus heard because of his reverence? What was the answer to Jesus' prayer? The answer to the prayer is in Luke 22:42. The answer to the prayer was the angel that God sent. Jesus prayed that the cup would be removed, and then Luke says, then, after that prayer, the angel came strengthening him. Strengthening him for what? To do what he had to do. In other words, the angel was God's response to Jesus' first prayer. And the answer is seen by the shift in the way in which Jesus would then pray. You see, he first prays, is there any other way? We need to redeem mankind. But is there any other way? He gets his answer. The angel comes and strengthens him. Now in verse 42, he says he went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken unless I drink it, may your will be done. So because the angel came and strengthened him for what lies ahead, Jesus knows the answer. He is willing and wants God's will to be done. If it's not possible for this cup to pass, the prayer is now, God, will you help me drink it? Which is why he does not ask for the cup to be removed. He doesn't ask for it to be removed because he realizes, as the angel is there strengthening him, this is what's got to be done. There is no other way. And so in the second prayer, Jesus did not go on praying for the cup to pass. He went on praying for success in drinking the cup of God's divine wrath that would be poured upon him on behalf of all mankind. So he left them, verse 44, and he went away once more, and I'm going to close with this last prayer. He prayed a third time. The text says he said the same thing, saying the same thing. The first answer to the prayer was the angel. The angel came and it strengthened Jesus. He now knows I have to go to the cross. The second answer to the prayer is that I will help you. I will give you what you need to drink the cup. So what's the answer to the third prayer as he prayed the same thing? Jesus continues praying. He knows that the cup will not pass. That's the answer to the first prayer. He knows that God is going to answer his prayer and give him success in drinking it, that he will go to the cross. The disciples are not going to come to his rescue and get him out of it. He's going there. And the third prayer, the answer is that he has, the time is now. The time has come. It says, in verse 45, he returned to his disciples and said, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come. The answer is, it's ready, it's time to go. The time has come. The Son of Man is delivered in the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. 3 prayers. 3 remarkable prayers in the face of crucifixion, where Jesus' soul is troubled to the point of death. I just want to close this out, and I think this is the most appropriate thing to do as we talk about 1, 2, 3 prayers, is just to spend some time in prayer. So if we would all just bow our heads, I would like to just go to God our Father in prayer. Heavenly Father,